I arrived at the office 43 minutes early on a Tuesday in March, the kind of morning when Boston's harbor turns silver and the Charles River catches the light like it's been polished. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for 10. I had no intention of being late. The Harrington Global Technologies building sits on State Street in downtown Boston, all limestone and glass, the kind of architecture that was meant to convey permanence and power in roughly equal measure. My father had chosen it when he took over the company in 1989. He told me once, over dinner at some charity benefit neither of us wanted to attend, that you could tell how a company thought about itself by the building it occupied. "We occupy this space," he'd said, as if the distinction mattered. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor. My office was there, corner unit, morning light, a view of the harbor if you stood at a particular angle and craned your neck. I had 2 large monitors, a desk made of some expensive walnut, and shelves lined with papers that nobody in the company would ever read. Applied physics research papers. Peer reviews. Patent applications. The work that had consumed the last 8 years of my life. The hallway was empty. I could hear my footsteps, the soft landing of my shoes on the polished concrete floor. It was 9:17 a.m. The boardroom was on the same floor, 3 corners down. As I passed, I noticed the glass doors were open slightly more than usual, and I heard voices, not the bright, performative voices of morning greeting, but something lower. Something deliberate. I should have kept walking. I should have gone to my office and prepared my quarterly report on applications of graphene composites in aerospace systems, which was what everyone expected from me, the quiet sister who did the technical work while my sister Madeline did the strategic thinking, while my brother Evan handled the money, while my father handled everything else with the certainty of a man who believed he had invented competence. But I was curious. The door was open just enough. Through the gap, I could see the long oak table where the board sat for these meetings. My father sat at the head, as always. Dorothy Klein, the board chair, was there, an old friend of my grandmother's, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and a posture that suggested she had never once in her life doubted her own judgment. My brother Evan was there, his face the particular shade of pale it went when he was uncomfortable. My sister Madeline was there, leaning forward slightly, animated in the way she became when she was winning at something. And then I heard her voice. "The valuation is solid," Madeline said. 3.2 billion, maybe 3.5 if we can get Alios to the table. I felt something shift in my chest. Not panic. Not yet. Just a precise, calibrated sense that something I didn't understand was being decided. "The separation will need to be surgical," my father said. His voice had that particular tone it took on in board meetings, authoritative, almost clinical. "We can't have anyone in the market knowing we're shopping the division." "What about Claire?" I heard my brother's voice, thin and uncertain. There was a pause. "Claire," my father said, "doesn't need to know." I didn't move. I stood very still in the hallway, my hand still on the edge of the door, and I listened. "The University Consortium in Singapore has already submitted a preliminary offer," Madeline continued. $0.7 billion for the patents, the database, and the research roadmap. That's conservative. The actual application value is probably triple that, but they'll handle the commercialization. It's clean. No licensing complications. No ongoing entanglements. "What about the team?" Dorothy Klein's voice. I couldn't see her expression. "They're already distributed," my sister said. "Half are on contract work for the aerospace division. The others can be transitioned. The ones who don't fit the corporate model were going to be phased out anyway." I realized I was holding my breath. "The trust fund Eleanor created," Evan said. His voice was even quieter now. "The one she left to." The trust fund is separate, and my father cut him off. And it's not enough to matter. Claire will be fine. She'll land somewhere. Academia, probably. Mitt would take her in a heartbeat. She's not a fighter, Evan. She never has been. I stepped back from the door. I turned around and walked down the hallway at a normal pace, my steps even, my breathing controlled. By the time I reached my office, my heart had stopped racing. By the time I sat down at my desk, I had already begun calculating. My first call was to Julia Prescott. We'd gone to law school together for exactly 1 semester before I realized I didn't have the temperament for it and transferred to physics. She'd stuck with it and become one of the most expensive corporate attorneys in Boston. We'd remained friends in the practical way of intelligent people who occasionally needed each other. I need to know, I said, without preamble, whether my patents are actually in my name or in the company's name. There was a pause. That's a very specific question, she said. Yes. Are you in trouble? Not yet, I said. But I need to know the answer before I know whether I'm in trouble. Julia knew me well enough not to ask questions that would take too long to answer. I'll pull the documentation today. Where are you? My office. On State Street. Stay there. Don't tell anyone what you're looking for. I'll call you back within 2 hours. I hung up and sat very still. The morning light was still coming through my window, catching dust motes, making the harbor look bright and empty. My files were extensive. I'd been methodical about this, about all of this, really. The research that I'd been conducting for 8 years had begun as a theoretical investigation into carbon nanotube structures and their application in composite materials. It had evolved, in ways I hadn't entirely anticipated, into something that could genuinely matter. Not just academically. Actually matter. In aerospace engineering, in infrastructure, in the kind of applications that large defense contractors and technology companies would pay billions to develop and commercialize. I had kept meticulous records. Notebooks, lab reports, peer reviews, grant applications. The intellectual property had seemed like an abstraction when I was doing the work, something to worry about later, after the science was solid. Now it seemed like the only thing that mattered. Julia called back at 11:34 a.m. The board meeting had been delayed. My father had called to ask if I wanted to present my quarterly report. I told him I had some technical issues to work through, and that it could wait until the next quarter. He'd accepted this without comment. The patents are in your name, Julia said without preamble. All of them. 37 applications, 21 of which are already granted. They're held through a personal LLC, Harrington Research IP Holdings. It's a subsidiary of something called the Eleanor Harrington Intellectual Property Trust. I felt something release inside me. Something I hadn't known I'd been holding. How is that possible? I asked. My father controls everything in this company. Your father doesn't control your grandmother, Julia said. Eleanor set this up 15 years ago. Before you'd even finished your doctorate. There's a letter in the trust documentation. She wanted you to see it. It's addressed to you specifically. I don't have a letter from my grandmother, I said. She's been dead for 6 years. It's in the trust documentation. She had the lawyers hold it. There are copies in a secure deposit box at Boston Private. The lawyer's name is Marcus Webb. He's expecting to hear from you. After we hung up, I sat with that information for a long time. My grandmother had been many things, a board member, an investor, a woman who wore Hermes scarves and drove vintage Mercedes sedans and spent every Thanksgiving asking pointed questions about everybody's personal lives. but I hadn't thought of her as someone who anticipated betrayal. Especially not my betrayal. She'd always seemed to like me, in her controlled and distant way, but we hadn't been close. Until now. I went to the secure deposit box that evening, after everyone else had left the building. The box was in a Boston private branch near Copley Square. Marcus Webb was a lawyer in his 70s with wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly formal manner of someone who took the substance of documents very seriously. The letter was handwritten, in my grandmother's precise script. My dear Claire, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've discovered what I always knew you would eventually discover, that this family is not built for integrity. We are built for accumulation. For control. For the kind of certainty that comes from having too much power for too long. But you are different. You were different from the moment you were born. I remember your father bringing you to the office when you were 6 months old. He showed you to everyone as if you were proof of something, proof that the legacy would continue, that his blood would carry forward his particular vision of success. And I watched you look at him, this tiny infant, with an expression that suggested you were already calculating whether his vision was worth inheriting. I decided that day to protect you. Not protect you in the way other people protect their granddaughters, with money and connections, though I've given you those too. But protect you with foresight. With preparation. I am leaving you the means to choose. The patents are yours. The trust is yours. And when they finally try to take what you've built, and they will try, Claire, because they cannot help themselves, you will have the choice to destroy them or to save them. I suspect you'll do something more interesting. I suspect you'll save the company by cutting out the sickness. The intellectual property documentation is comprehensive. The funding trail is clean. And there is a clause in the corporate charter that I insisted Eleanor's lawyers include in 1998. If intellectual property theft is attempted by senior management, voting authority on the board transfers to the largest individual shareholder. Which, by the terms of my will, is you. I am banking on your intelligence. I am betting, as I have always bet, on quiet power. Not the kind that yells in boardrooms, but the kind that has already won before the game begins. Do what you think is right. Your affectionate grandmother. Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times. I folded it very carefully. Marcus Webb offered me copies, but I declined. I needed to sit with the original, the actual paper, the actual ink. Is there anything else? He asked. The clause in the corporate charter, I said. Is it enforceable? Absolutely, he said. The board ratified it. It's been in effect for 26 years. No one has ever had to invoke it, but legally, it's quite clear. I left the bank and walked along Copley Plaza, watching the light fade. There were students everywhere, Boston University, Northeastern. The whole city was full of young people who believed they were going to change the world, who hadn't yet learned how thoroughly the world was designed to resist change. My sister called me that night at 8:47 p.m. We rarely spoke in the evenings. Dad wants to have a family dinner, as she said. Next Thursday. Just us. He wants to discuss some structural changes to the company. What kind of structural changes? I asked. He didn't say. He just said he wanted everyone there. Even Mom. Our mother lived in a house on the outskirts of Boston, in a town with good schools and quiet tree-lined streets, which was where my father had deposited her after they'd stopped pretending to have a marriage. She appeared at company functions and family holidays, but mostly she lived her own life, which consisted of charitable boards and golf and a reading group that met every other Tuesday. I'll be there, I said. I spent the next week gathering documentation. I talked to Michael Chen, my research partner, in coded language that involved a lot of theoretical discussion about whether certain intellectual property protections might hypothetically be inadequate. He understood immediately, because Michael was the kind of person who understood the subtext of everything, the kind of person who had chosen to work on applied research with minimal fame and maximum integrity for reasons he'd never quite explained. Your backups, he said, are already safe. What do you mean? I mean that 6 months ago, when your father started making demands about server access, I preserved all of your original datasets on an isolated system. And I may have also kept copies of the research notes on an external drive. Also safely isolated. Also somewhere your father would never find them. I felt something loosen in my chest. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me, he said. This company was built on your work. That work is important. Betrayal is easy when you assume the person you're betraying is too trusting to defend themselves. I had a feeling you wouldn't be. I met with Julia 3 times that week. She brought a forensic accountant and a corporate litigation specialist. Together, they constructed a picture of systematic undermining, grant requests that had been blocked by my father, budget lines that had been shifted without my knowledge, consulting contracts that had been awarded to external firms to replicate work I'd already completed. The picture was damning. It was also completely legal. There were no explicit falsifications, no direct statements that had been lies. It was all implication and misdirection, the kind of corporate manipulation that was so standard it barely qualified as corruption. The real problem, Julia said, spreading documents across her conference room table, is the data theft. Your sister presented research at 3 different conferences over the past 18 months using methodologies and preliminary findings from your work. She didn't cite you. She didn't credit you. And she didn't have authorization to use those findings. Can you prove that? I asked. Absolutely. You have lab notebooks with timestamps. You have email records. You have peer review documentation. You have her presentations. It's completely provable. What do they think I'll do? They think you'll do what you've always done, Julia said. Nothing. They think you'll be shocked and hurt, and then you'll eventually get another job somewhere, and you'll write papers about your research and you'll move on. They think you're the kind of person who prioritizes harmony over justice. Am I? I asked. I don't know, Julia said. But I'm guessing if you were, you wouldn't be sitting in my conference room right now. The family dinner was held at a French restaurant in the Back Bay that my father had been going to for 20 years. The kind of place where the wine list was longer than most novels and the waitstaff moved like ghosts. My mother was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table near the window, looking uncomfortable in the way she always looked at family functions. My brother arrived next, then my sister. My father came last, which he always did, as if his arrival was the event everyone had been waiting for. I'm glad you could all make it, he said, once we'd ordered. I want to discuss the future of the company. My sister reached over and squeezed my father's arm. She had this gesture she deployed when she was proud of him, when he was about to do something she'd been helping him plan. We've been approached, and my father continued, by several international firms interested in acquiring the intellectual property from the Advanced Materials Division. The valuations are substantial. We're talking billions of dollars. It would be transformative for the company's financial position. He said it like he was announcing good news. Like he was telling us we'd won something. The IP is already theirs, I said quietly. The patents. The research. It's all mine. There was a pause. My father set down his wine glass very carefully. The patents were developed using company resources, he said. Using company time, company funding, company facilities. That makes them company property. Actually, I said, the research was funded through a separate trust structure that Eleanor established. And the patents were registered in my personal name, as part of that trust. There is no ambiguity about this, legally. I've had my attorney review the documentation. I watched my father's face change. Not dramatically. Just a small tightening around his eyes. A particular compression of his mouth that I'd learned to recognize years ago, when I was young enough to still think his opinions mattered. Eleanor, he said, he has been dead for 6 years. And she was not a lawyer. No, I said. But she hired very good ones. And she anticipated this conversation. My mother set down her fork. What are you saying? She asked. I'm saying that my sister has been presenting my research as her own. I'm saying that my father has been systematically blocking my grant requests and underfunding my lab. And I'm saying that I'm not going to allow either of those things to continue. You're being dramatic, my sister said. She smiled like she was explaining something to a child. We're all part of the same company. Your research is the company's research. The distinction you're making doesn't actually exist. It exists legally, I said. And it exists morally. Those are the two systems I operate within. I'm not sure which one applies to you. My father stood up. The restaurant was quiet enough that several people at nearby tables turned to look. You are being incredibly ungrateful, he said. This family has given you everything. The opportunity, the resources, the platform to do your work. And you're going to throw it away because of some technical distinction in a trust document? I'm going to protect what's mine, I said. And I'm going to make sure that intellectual property theft is treated as seriously as it should be. You're 18 months away from losing your entire career, and my father said quietly. Think very carefully about whether you want that. He left. Just stood up and walked out of the restaurant, leaving his wine half finished and his food untouched. My brother followed him, offering quiet apologies to my mother and me as he went. My sister stayed for another moment, smiling at me across the table in a way that suggested she knew something I didn't yet understand. You know, she said, that you're not going to win this. You're not a fighter, Claire. You never have been. And this company is run by people who've been fighting for decades. I'm not fighting, I said. I'm just telling the truth. Same thing, she said, and then she was gone too. My mother and I sat in silence for a long moment. The waiter approached uncertainly, as if he wasn't sure whether to ask if we wanted to order dessert or simply bring the check. I'm sorry, I said to my mother. Don't apologize to me, she said. Apologize to yourself for wasting all these years believing that this family was ever going to value integrity over profit. She ordered coffee. We didn't talk much after that. There wasn't really anything to say. The next morning, my building access card stopped working. I called security and they told me that my father had requested an immediate suspension of my access pending an internal investigation into the unauthorized use of company resources. Michael called me within an hour. His access had been suspended too. So had 3 other members of our research team. So had our administrative assistant. The only person who'd kept access was my sister, who worked in corporate innovation and hadn't actually spent time in our labs in 2 years. Julia called an emergency meeting. By that afternoon, we'd filed a cease and desist letter to my father, my sister, and the company board, identifying the intellectual property violations and threatening legal action if any attempts were made to commercialize the patents without my consent. We filed it through the court system, which meant it became a matter of public record. The news broke on Thursday morning. The Boston Globe ran a story, a corporate dynasty faces internal conflict over research patent rights. It was the kind of story that business journalists loved, family conflict, intellectual property disputes, the suggestion of corporate malfeasance. By that afternoon, CNBC was calling Julia for comment. My father called an emergency board meeting for Friday morning. "You're attempting to destroy this company," he said, when I arrived at the boardroom. He was standing. Everyone else was seated. Dorothy Klein was at the head of the table, looking grave. "I'm attempting to protect my own intellectual property," I said. "If that destroys the company, then the company was already destroyed." "You're the betrayer here," my sister said. She was standing next to my father. "You're the one who's trying to undermine the family legacy." "The family legacy," I said, "is fraud. I'm not undermining it. I'm stopping it." Dorothy Klein raised her hand for silence. She was old, but she moved like someone who was used to people listening to her. "I was Eleanor's friend," she said, "for 43 years. And I want to know, Claire, whether you're certain of your ground here. Because I'm looking at documents that your grandmother apparently prepared years ago that gave you significant leverage. And I want to know if you actually understand what you're doing." "I understand," I said, "that I own the intellectual property. I understand that it's being stolen. And I understand that if I don't stop that now, it will never stop." "If you invoke the voting clause," Dorothy said quietly, "you're going to destroy your father. You understand that? You're going to take control of this company, and you're going to eliminate his authority entirely. There's no coming back from that for him." "I know," I said. "And you're comfortable with that?" I thought about my grandmother, sitting in this building 30 years ago, looking at her daughter-in-law and her grandsons and deciding that someone needed to be protected. I thought about her deciding that protection meant power, and that power meant being willing to do the hard things. "I am," I said. I presented the documentation. I presented the patent registrations. I presented the email chains where my sister had requested access to my research data without authorization. I presented the conference presentations where she'd used my methodologies without credit. I presented the data theft. My brother, sitting quietly near the end of the table, said nothing. But when I looked at him, he nodded. Barely perceptible. But there. Then I cited the clause in the corporate charter. The one Eleanor had insisted on. The one that said if intellectual property theft was attempted by senior management, voting authority transferred to the largest individual shareholder. Which, by Eleanor's will and the subsequent trust documentation, was me. That clause, and my father said, his voice very quiet, it was meant to protect the company. It was meant, I said, to protect me. The vote happened over the course of 3 hours. By 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, I had majority control of the board. By 5 o'clock, my father had been stripped of his authority as CEO. By 6 o'clock, my sister had been notified that she was under internal investigation and had been placed on immediate administrative leave. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. I felt like someone who'd been holding their breath for so long that they'd forgotten what normal breathing felt like. Julia brought champagne to the office that evening, but I didn't want to drink it. Instead, I sat in the boardroom as the sun set over Boston, and I thought about everything that was going to have to happen next. There was an internal investigation. There were media statements. There were meetings with lawyers and accountants and public relations specialists. There were quiet conversations with board members about what the company was actually going to become if it didn't continue to be built on the kind of ruthlessness that had always defined it. My sister was removed from the company. The investigation revealed 17 separate instances of data theft and 3 instances of research presentation fraud. She faced criminal charges. She faced civil litigation. She faced the particular kind of professional destruction that comes when you've been exposed as a thief and no one in the industry will touch you again. My father didn't come to the office after that Friday. He took a leave of absence. Then he resigned. Then he essentially disappeared, in the way that people with enough money can disappear, into a quiet life somewhere else, where nobody knew him or cared about his legacy. My brother stayed. I offered him that choice. He took it. 6 months later, I restructured the company. We disbanded the division that had been responsible for commercializing intellectual property through questionable international deals. We created a new research department that was dedicated to publishing findings and sharing knowledge with the scientific community. We hired brilliant people who'd been driven away from corporate environments because they wanted to do meaningful work. We didn't maximize profit. We maximized impact. Michael and I published 17 peer-reviewed papers in 18 months. We filed 62 new patent applications. We licensed our technology to 3 different companies at reasonable rates. We started a mentorship program for young researchers who wanted to work in industry without sacrificing their integrity. I was appointed CEO, which was partly amusing and partly surreal. I'd spent my entire career trying to avoid the kind of visibility that came with leadership. Now I was spending half my time in boardrooms and half my time in labs. My mother came by the office one afternoon in September. It was nearly a year after the family dinner, 6 months after the restructuring. "Your father asked me to tell you something," Ishi said. We were in my office. I'd kept my old corner space, even though I now had access to the larger executive suite. The harbor was still visible from my desk. "What?" I asked. "He said that Eleanor was right about you. He said he'd known it for years, but he hadn't wanted to admit it. He said that you were different, and that he'd spent your entire life trying to make you less different, and that he'd been wrong about all of it." "Is he okay?" I asked. "I don't know," my mother said. "But I think he's finally thinking about things that matter. That's something." She paused. She was wearing a blue cardigan, and she looked smaller than I remembered, as if the weight of decades of family pretense had physically diminished her. "I was afraid," she said, "that you were going to become like him. That you were going to let this power corrupt you in the way it corrupted him. But you didn't. You used it to change things." "The company still makes profit," I said. "I'm not pretending we're a charity." "I know," she said. "But you did something more important than make money. You showed that it was possible to do both. That was worth seeing." After she left, I sat at my desk for a long time, watching the light change across the harbor. People have asked me, over the months that followed, whether I regret what happened. Whether I wish I'd handled it differently. Whether, in some quieter moment, I think about my father and my sister and feel the kind of complicated sympathy that comes when you've fully destroyed someone and then have to keep existing in a world where they continue to exist. The honest answer is no. I don't regret it. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my family was constructed in such a way that betrayal was inevitable. But I don't regret defending myself. More than that, I don't regret who I became in the process of defending myself. I became someone who understood that power isn't something that yells and threatens. Power is something that has already won before the game begins. Power is preparation. Power is patience. Power is the quiet understanding that intelligence, in the long term, defeats every other kind of force. Eleanor knew that. She'd built her entire life around that knowledge. She'd wanted to pass it on to me, but I'd had to learn it through betrayal rather than inheritance. That seemed like the kind of knowledge you had to learn yourself. No one could teach you the value of quiet power. You had to feel it, in the moment when everyone expected you to break and you didn't. It's late now. Late October. The sun is setting earlier these days, and the harbour has turned that particular shade of grey that suggests winter is coming. I'm alone in my office. Everyone else has gone home. There's a report on my desk about the new composite materials research program, about the scientists we're recruiting, about the patents we're going to file, about the future we're building. I pick it up and I read it, and I think about my grandmother sitting in this building 40 years ago, looking at the raw materials of her family and deciding what to preserve and what to transform. I think about her decision to protect me not with money or connections, but the kind of knowledge that only comes from having lived long enough to understand how power actually works. And then I close the report, I put it in my bag, and I leave work on time, because that's something I learned this year too, that power, real power, knows when to stop. The revolution didn't begin with anger. It began with foresight.